It's wild to think about how a completely mundane, totally forgettable administrative detail could quite literally rewrite the entire concept of British citizenship. Well, in this explainer, we are unpacking a really fascinating analysis by Lawson Akigbe from the Center for Nigerian Progress. He takes a completely unique angle on a recent housing policy proposal from Reform UK. Because instead of just debating budgets or housing targets like you might expect, this piece traces the policy back to something you've probably entirely overlooked, the small print on everyday forms. It is a brilliant look at how the mundane can suddenly become deeply, deeply political.
Akigbe starts things off by pointing out a highly peculiar question hidden right there in the drop-down menus of standard British car insurance forms. Just picture this for a second. You're filling out a form, you check off that you have a license, you confirm you're a British citizen, and then, right in the middle of it all, it asks, were you born in the United Kingdom? When you actually stop to think about it, it's a pretty bizarre question. I mean, birth is an event you had absolutely zero say in. It happened decades before you could even read. Yet here it is, asking exactly where you were extracted from your mother, as if the location of your maternity ward somehow dictates your ability to, navigate a roundabout.
And because this was buried deep in a drop-down menu rather than, say, blasted across a political billboard, the insurance industry quietly turned the location where you were born into a literal data point for your premium. It just became this background fact of administrative life that went entirely unchallenged. Nobody marched in the streets, nobody protested outside Lloyd's of London. It just kind of slipped into the everyday bureaucratic machinery, filed right next to postcode lotteries and those weird extra charges for paying your bills monthly.
But here's where things get really fascinating. Reform UK has taken that quiet, background administrative habit and elevated it to a core policy platform. They've essentially pulled this concept out of the buried PDFs and put it front and center at a press conference. So instead of an insurance actuary calculating a premium, we now have a political party proposing a brand new way to allocate government resources based on that exact same question of birthplace. So let's break down exactly what it is they're proposing.
Reform UK's deputy leader, Richard Tice, has pitched a pretty bold infrastructure promise. The party says that if they enter government, they are going to build 50,000 affordable homes every single year. The kicker here, they claim this will be financed without any new taxes or borrowing. Now, the analysis humorously compares this to promising a birth cake that requires no oven, no flour, and, well, no birth cake. But the promise of the homes themselves is really just the wrapping paper for the true core of this policy.
Right? So to justify the really strict rules they want to apply to these new homes, Tice points to a very real, very staggering number. The 1.3 million people who are currently waiting for social housing in Britain today. He argues that most of the people sitting in that massive queue are currently without jobs. So the party looks at that 1.3 million, and they propose a highly specific filter to determine who gets to skip to the front of the line.
Out of that massive wait list, Reform proposes drawing a queue filtered by a specific moral weighting. Let's look at the tiers. First in line, British-born workers under the age of 35. Next up, military veterans. And finally, married couples with children. Now, notice what sits right at the absolute top of that list. It's not just British citizens. It explicitly prioritizes the British-born.
Now, housing charities counter this entire premise. They argue that Britain's actual underlying sickness is a massive lack of supply, not the sequence of the queue. They point out that Britain doesn't necessarily have too many people asking for homes, it simply has way too few homes to actually give them. So from their perspective, taking a massive shortage and simply rearranging who stands where in line doesn't actually solve the shortage at all. It just decides who gets to be disappointed last.
But Akigbe's analysis makes a really sharp observation here. Sequencing is exactly where the politics lives. Simply promising to build more homes is administratively dull, right? Adding a birthplace requirement, though, well, that gives the electorate something to feel superior about while they wait in that exact same queue. By doing this, the piece argues, the policy essentially converts a standard everyday housing crisis into a cheap loyalty test. And unlike actual houses, loyalty tests are incredibly cheap to build, and they literally never run out of stock.
This brings up a brilliant cultural comparison made in the piece to a famous British comedy sketch about the cricket test. If you haven't seen it, a classic sketch features an immigration officer interviewing an airport worker who is clearly, unmistakably British. The officer asks, "Where were you born?" The worker replies, "Hull." Unimpressed, the officer goes, "And your parents?" The worker says, "Sheffield." The officer just keeps digging, going generations back, until finally hitting India, which was the answer he was hunting for the entire time. Only then does the officer ask the ultimate loyalty question, if England played India at cricket, who would you support?
The reason that joke worked so well and still hits hard today is because it highlighted a very real cultural tension. It wasn't really about geography, and it definitely wasn't about sports. It was about which citizens are forced to prove their loyalty on this endless, exhausting loop, and which citizens are accepted completely after the very first question. It highlights a really sharp divide between citizens who are simply assumed to belong and citizens who have to constantly justify their presence.
So the argument here is that reform's housing policy is basically the bureaucratic descendant of that exact comedy sketch, just without the laugh track playing in the background. By making British-born the top qualifying category, you aren't just describing an age bracket or a birthplace, you're swapping the immigration officer's microphone for a housing officer's clipboard. The follow-up questions essentially write themselves, right? Born in Britain, yes, but were your parents?
This dynamic would build a completely unprecedented legal framework. To actually implement this in the real world, it would require a twin-track allocation system. That means creating one dedicated fast-pass lane for the British-born and a completely separate secondary lane for naturalized citizens, even though both groups hold the exact same legal British passport.
And this isn't just some minor rule change. Reform's own officials actually admit this would require entirely new legislation. Why? Because right now, discriminating by origin within a single unified class of citizenship directly collides with existing UK equality statutes. These are laws Britain literally spent decades designing specifically to avoid treating citizens differently based on where they originally came from.
So the crucial takeaway from this explainer is that we aren't just talking about a minor administrative tweak. To build this twin-track lane, Parliament would have to legislate a formal legal distinction between British citizens by birth and British citizens by naturalization. As the piece heavily emphasizes, that is a foundational rewrite of what the word citizen is legally permitted to mean. It fractures a previously unified legal status into two pieces.
Akigbe wraps up the piece with this incredibly powerful observation. He notes that the grand old principle of English law, the idea that everyone residing within the realm is equally subject to and equally protected by the law, is not just some decorative flourish. It is the load-bearing wall of the entire justice system. It's the very architecture that separates equal societies from segregated ones.
To bring this all full circle, let's think about it like a giant swimming pool. While the insurance industry only tested the waters of birthplace discrimination with a quiet little drop-down menu on a driving form, Reform UK is proposing to build a massive, official, government-funded swimming pool. It's 50,000 homes deep, supposedly requires no borrowing, but it firmly requires a very specific kind of birth certificate right there at the door just to get in.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound question about legal precedents. Because if a society is willing to rewrite the foundational equal rights of citizenship just to rearrange a housing queue, how will that legal fracture reshape society at large? Once you establish that naturalized citizens have a different legal standing than birth citizens for housing, what other rights, services, or protections could eventually be divided by this new twin-track citizenship? It's a deeply consequential question to ponder as we look at the fine print of our future. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer.